I worked 30 long years to build my family's legacy. Sleepless nights, broken bones, missed birthdays, sacrifices beyond words. Yet my own son, the very one I was building it all for, stood in front of me one evening with fire in his eyes and called me a failure. A failure. The weight of those words crushed me more than any loss I had ever endured. My heart bled as I stared at him, wondering how a son could bury his father alive with nothing but a single word. But he didn't stop there. What he did next was far worse, something that would change the course of my life forever. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what would you do if your own blood, your own child, became your enemy? If you want to know how this story unfolds, make sure you stay with me to the very end. Don't forget to like, watch, and subscribe for more. My name is Richard. I was born in Ohio, the son of a steelworker and a schoolteacher. Life wasn't easy, but my parents taught me two things that carried me through every storm. Work hard and protect your family's name. I carried those lessons like treasures in my heart, and when I became a man, I swore that my children would never taste the bitter hunger and humiliation I once knew. I met my wife, Linda, at a church fundraiser. She was warm, gentle, and strong enough to balance my restless ambition. Together, we built a home, brick by brick, filled with laughter and dreams. We were blessed with two children, David, our firstborn son, and Emily, our daughter. David was born with the same fire I once had, curious, sharp, and restless. Emily was softer, more like her mother, but with a quiet strength that surprised me as she grew. I poured my soul into building a family business, a construction company that started with just me, a truck, and an old toolbox my father left me. For 30 years, I expanded into something bigger than I ever dreamed. Contracts with the city, buildings that would stand for generations, and a name that commanded respect in Ohio. People said the Miller legacy was strong, and I believed it was something my children would be proud to inherit. But here's the bitter truth about family. Love doesn't always grow the way you expect it to. Somewhere along the way, cracks began to form in the walls I built. At first, they were small. David questioning my decisions, doubting the risks I took, accusing me of holding him back from modernizing the company. I thought it was youthful impatience. I thought he would grow into the man I wanted him to be. But David had other plans. I remember one evening, long before the day he called me a failure. I came home from a meeting to find Linda in tears. She had discovered that David had been using company funds for his personal ventures, nightclubs, flashy cars, and investments that bled money. I was furious. I confronted him, my voice shaking with both anger and heartbreak. Instead of remorse, he smirked. You're stuck in the past, Dad. Your way of running things is outdated. I'm the future. It wasn't just about the money. It was about betrayal. The son I raised with my own sweat was slowly becoming the man who would tear down everything I had built. At first, I tried to guide him gently, to reason with him, to remind him that this company wasn't just about profit. It was about family. But he mocked me, saying the world didn't care about legacy, only about power. The tension between us grew thicker with every passing day. Emily tried to keep peace, begging me not to fight with her brother, and Linda would whisper late at night, "Please, Richard, don't push him away. He's still our son." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe love was enough to heal the growing distance. But then came the night everything changed. It was late, around 10 p.m., when I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. On the other end was a voice I'll never forget. It was the police. They told me David had been arrested in connection with an armed robbery. My son, my blood, had been caught with two men who robbed a local jewelry store. My heart stopped. When I arrived at the station, I saw him sitting behind the bars, his face bruised, his eyes cold. He didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like a stranger. "Dad," he said with a smirk, "don't look so shocked. You built this empire, but you never built me." I felt my knees weaken. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just rebellion. It was war. And just when I thought the night couldn't get any darker, the officer pulled me aside and told me something that sent ice through my veins. One of the men arrested with David had killed a store clerk during the robbery. That meant David wasn't just facing theft charges. He could be tied to murder. The weight of it crushed me. But deep down, a storm began to rise in my chest. My son had spit on my legacy, dragged our family name into the dirt, and looked me in the eye as if I were the fool. But I wasn't done. Not yet. And that was the night I made a vow. If my own son had chosen to turn me into his enemy, then I would fight him with everything I had. He thought I was weak, a relic of the past. But he had no idea how dangerous a man becomes when he has nothing left to lose. That vow set everything in motion. What followed was betrayal, blood, and a courtroom battle that would rip our family apart. But I'll never forget the moment it began, with my son behind bars, smirking at me as though I was a failure. What he didn't know was that I was about to show him just how much strength still burned in me. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and sweat. The kind of smell that lingers when hope and despair collide in one place. I sat there, my hands clasped so tightly together that my knuckles turned white. Across the room, my son David sat beside his lawyer, dressed in a suit that didn't belong to him. It belonged to me. I had paid for it, just as I had paid for his bail, his defense attorney, his food, his very life up to that moment. And yet, he wouldn't look at me. Not once. The judge read out the charges. Armed robbery, accessory to murder, conspiracy. Each word struck me like a hammer. I wanted to shout, "That's not my son. That's not the boy I raised." But silence is a cruel companion in moments like that. All I could do was watch. Linda sat beside me, tears streaming down her face. Emily held her hand, her jaw tight, trying to be strong. She glanced at me, eyes pleading, as if asking, "Dad, fix this, please." But how could I fix a boy who didn't want saving? When the prosecution called their witnesses, the room thickened with tension. One of David's so-called friends, an accomplice, spoke against him. He claimed David had planned the robbery, that David was the brains behind it. My chest burned with shame. My son, the heir to the Miller legacy, reduced to a criminal mastermind in the eyes of strangers. Then came the video evidence. Grainy footage from a security camera showed 3 masked men storming the jewelry store. One of them moved in a way that made my stomach twist. It was David. I knew his stance, his walk, the way he carried himself. There was no denying it. As the evidence piled up, I watched David lean back casually, whispering to his lawyer with that same arrogant smirk. He wasn't worried. He wasn't even ashamed. And that was the dagger in my heart. Not that he'd sinned, but that he didn't care. When it was our turn, David's lawyer tried to spin the story. My client was in the wrong place at the wrong time, he argued. He had no idea his friends were planning violence. He was merely caught up in the moment. Lies. Smooth, poisonous lies. But the court wasn't the only place battles were being fought. Behind closed doors, whispers filled the air, neighbors, business partners. Even church members started questioning the Miller name. Some pulled their contracts from my company. Others refused to look me in the eye. 30 years of sweat, of brick and stone, of blood and sacrifice. It was crumbling overnight, and the wrecking ball was my own son. The betrayal cut deeper when I found out David had been using company accounts to launder money for his so-called friends. Thousands of dollars gone. I confronted him about it after one of the hearings. We stood in the hallway, just the two of us. "Why, David? Why are you doing this to me? To your mother? To Emily? To our name?" My voice cracked with the weight of my pain. He leaned in close, his words sharp as glass. "Because you're a failure. Dad, you built an empire of dust. All these years, you thought you were a king, but really, you're just an old man clinging to bricks. I'll build something bigger without you. And when you're gone, nobody will even remember you." My knees nearly buckled. The son I once held in my arms, who used to run to me after scraping his knee, now looked me dead in the eye and stripped me of every ounce of dignity. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the company yard, staring at the heavy machines, the trucks, the buildings my hands had raised, and all I saw was ruin. My own son had declared war on me, and if I let him win, everything I had worked for would rot in the ground. It was then that the rage inside me found a voice. Revenge wasn't just a choice, it was survival. If David wanted to see me as his enemy, then I would play the part. He thought I was finished, a relic, but I still had power. I still had fight, and I would use every weapon I had left to destroy the monster he had become, even if it meant destroying a part of myself. The next morning, I made a decision that would shake the very bones of our family. I walked into the district attorney's office and offered to cooperate. I had documents, bank statements, financial records, emails, that proved David had been draining company accounts and lying about it for years. The DA leaned back in his chair, surprised. "You're saying you'll testify against your own son?" My jaw tightened. If that's what it takes to show him what failure really looks like, then yes. I felt my heart crack as I said those words. But sometimes a man must burn his house to the ground to kill the rats inside. That was the moment I crossed the line. There would be no going back. But fate wasn't done with me yet. 2 nights later, as I left the office late, I felt the cold barrel of a gun press against the back of my head. A low voice whispered, "You should have minded your business, old man." My blood froze, and before I could even turn around, the gun clicked. The sound of the gun clicking behind my head was the loudest silence I had ever heard. My breath caught in my throat. My knees threatened to give way. For a moment, I thought it was over, that 30 years of sweat, sacrifice, and pain would end right there in a dark parking lot. But then nothing. The gun didn't fire. The man cursed under his breath. His hand shook slightly against the back of my skull. That split-second hesitation saved me. I swung around, grabbing his wrist with every ounce of strength left in my old bones. We struggled. The gun fell to the ground with a clatter that echoed in the empty night. The man was younger, stronger, but I was desperate. Rage gives an old man a kind of strength no youth can measure. I slammed him against the hood of my truck, fists flying until his nose bled. He kicked me off, stumbling, then darted into the shadows before I could grab him again. My chest heaved. My shirt was torn. My hands were bloody. But I was alive, shaking. I bent down and picked up the gun. My fingers trembled as I studied it. Cold, loaded, real. Whoever had sent this man wanted me gone. And in my gut, I knew the truth. This wasn't random. This was David's doing. I drove home in silence that night, the gun on the passenger seat like a silent witness. When I walked to the front door, Linda saw my torn shirt, my bloody hands, and gasped. "Richard, what happened to you?" I told her half the truth, that someone had attacked me, that I barely survived. But I couldn't bear to tell her what my heart whispered, that our own son may have been behind it. She wept, holding my face in her hands, begging me to let the police handle it. But how could I? How could I tell the police I suspected my boy wanted me dead? How could I admit to the world that the son I once carried on my shoulders now carried a gun for my head? The days that followed were a blur of hearings, lawyer meetings, and whispers. My company bled contracts. Partners abandoned ship. Reporters camped outside my gate, hungry for the story of the Miller family scandal. Emily stopped going out, too embarrassed to face her friends. Linda barely spoke. The house was quiet, heavy with shame. But silence breeds planning. And I was planning. I went through every file, every record, every hidden trail David had left behind. He thought he was clever, but arrogance leaves footprints. I found connections to loan sharks, shady businessmen, and even gang members in the city. Piece by piece, I began to stitch together the web he had woven. It wasn't just theft. It wasn't just rebellion. David was building his own empire, a dirty empire funded by blood money. And I realized then that he hadn't just turned his back on me. He was trying to replace me. One evening, Emily came into my study, her eyes swollen from crying. She hesitated at the door, then whispered, "Dad, is David really guilty?" Her question tore through me. I wanted to lie, to shield her from the ugliness. But lies had already destroyed too much. "Emily," I said, my voice breaking, "your brother has made choices that I can't defend. He's not the boy we knew anymore." She collapsed into my arms, sobbing, and as I held her, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Emily, for Linda, for the family named David had dragged through the mud. If I let him win, I wouldn't just lose my company. I'd lose everything. The next day in court, the prosecution revealed a bombshell, a hidden recording. One of David's accomplices had worn a wire during a meeting. On the tape, David's voice was clear as day. If my father doesn't step down, I'll make sure he does, one way or another. The courtroom gasped. Linda clutched her chest. Emily buried her face in her hands. And me? I sat there frozen, the words slicing through me like knives. My son had spoken the death sentence against me with his own lips. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Every eye in that room turned to me, not with pity, but with horror. The story wasn't just about David anymore. It was about the war between father and son, a war no family should ever fight. When court adjourned, reporters swarmed us. Cameras flashed. Microphones shoved in my face. Mr. Miller, did you know your son wanted you dead? Mr. Miller, are you afraid for your life? Mr. Miller, do you regret building this legacy? I said nothing. Silence was safer. But inside, the storm raged hotter than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the house like a ghost. Every sound felt like a threat. Every shadow felt like an enemy. Until finally, I sat at my desk, staring at the gun I had taken from that man in the parking lot, and a thought crept into my mind. A thought darker than any I had ever entertained. If David wants me dead, maybe it's time I show him what real death looks like. The thought terrified me, but it also tempted me. And then, as if the devil himself was watching, the phone rang. I answered, and a voice I didn't recognize said four chilling words, "Your son wants blood." The line went dead. The phone call echoed in my ears long after the line went dead. Your son wants blood. The words crawled under my skin like venom. I sat there, the receiver still pressing my ear, listening to the silence on the other end. For the first time in my life, I didn't know if I was hearing a warning or a promise. I slammed the phone down, my hand shaking. Linda walked in just then, carrying a folded blanket. She saw my face and froze. "Richard, what is it?" I wanted to tell her. I wanted to pour it all out. But the fear in her eyes stopped me. I couldn't burden her with the full weight of the storm. Not yet. So I lied. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just another crank call." But inside, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about court anymore. This was blood feud. The very next day, my suspicion was confirmed. When I arrived at my office, the windows were shattered. Spray painted across the front wall, in jagged red letters, was one word: traitor. My employees stood outside in silence, too afraid to enter. Some quit on the spot. My company, the one I built from dust and broken fingernails, was crumbling faster than I could hold it together. That night, I found Linda sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale. She whispered, "Richard, Emily says she saw a car following her from school." My chest tightened. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was war spilling into our home. I called the police, but their answers were cold, rehearsed. "We'll look into it." Nothing came of it. So I did what any desperate father would do. I began to protect my family myself. I boarded up the broken windows. I hired private security to shadow Emily when she went out. I started sleeping with that gun under my pillow. But the more I protected, the more I realized something. David had already gotten inside our home, not with guns or spray paint, but with betrayal. He had planted a seed of fear so deep that even silence felt dangerous. And then came the breaking point. It was a Friday night when the police knocked on my door. I opened it to find two officers standing there, their faces grim. "Mr. Miller, we need you to come with us." My heart stopped. "What's happened?" One officer shifted uncomfortably before saying, "There's been an incident involving your son." At the station, I was told David had gotten into a violent fight behind bars. A man was dead, stabbed with a shank. The officers weren't sure if David had done it himself or if he'd ordered it. But either way, he was now facing murder charges on top of everything else. I sat there in a hard chair, my head in my hands, wondering how far my boy had fallen. But just as I was drowning in despair, David walked past, escorted by guards. His lip was split, his shirt torn, but his eyes burned with fire that chilled me to the bone. He looked right at me and spat on the ground. "You did this," he hissed before the guards dragged him away. Those 3 words cut deeper than any blade. You did this. And for a moment, I wondered if he was right. Had I worked too hard? Had I crushed him under the weight of my legacy? Had I turned him into this monster without knowing it? The guilt gnawed at me, but then the rage answered. No, I had given him everything. Opportunities one never had. A family name to be proud of. A business to inherit. He wasn't a victim. He was a traitor. From that moment, my guilt hardened into something else. Something sharper. Something lethal. That night, I opened the locked drawer in my study and pulled out the folder I had been building for weeks, a collection of documents, photos, and recordings tying David to every dirty deal he had made. Loan sharks, fraud, extortion, enough evidence to bury him so deep the world would forget his name. I stared at the folder for a long time, the weight of it pressing down on me. This wasn't just about saving myself anymore. It was about ending him, my own son. And as the clock ticked past midnight, I made the decision. I would walk into that courtroom, not as his father, but as his executioner. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. The very next morning, as I left for the DA's office with the folder tucked under my arm, my car exploded. The blast threw me against the pavement, fire searing my skin, glass slicing into my flesh. My ears rang, the world spinning. Through the smoke, I saw flames devouring the car that had carried me for years. If I had been inside just seconds earlier, I would have been ash. Someone wanted me dead. No, someone needed me dead. And deep down, I knew exactly who that someone was. The explosion was deafening. I lay on the pavement, coughing smoke, my ears ringing like church bells at war. Fire licked the night sky. My car nothing but a twisted inferno. I could feel warm blood running down my face from a gash above my eye. But none of that mattered. Only one thought beat in my skull. David tried to kill me. Paramedics rushed me to the hospital. Linda and Emily were there within the hour, their faces pale with terror. Emily clung to my hand, whispering, "Dad, please, don't leave me too." Linda's tears fell silently onto the sheets. I want to comfort them, but inside, the storm was too strong. Enough was enough. David had gone beyond rebellion, beyond betrayal. He had become a predator, and predators only stop when they're put down. The police came to take my statement. I told them about the threats, the call, the spray paint, everything except the name of the man I suspected. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hand my son over on a silver platter, not until I was sure I had the knife sharpened enough to cut clean. As soon as I was discharged, I returned to my study. My body ached, but my mind was still. I pulled out the folder of evidence, spread it across the desk like a general studying a battlefield. Every loan, every laundered dollar, every shady contact. David had left a trail of rot, and I was going to follow it to the end. That's when I discovered something that turned my stomach to ice. Hidden in the account, buried under layers of shell companies, was a payment linked to the very gang rumored to have provided explosives. The transaction was signed by one name only, David Miller. There was no more room for doubt. My son hadn't just betrayed me. He had tried to erase me from existence. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, staring at his childhood photos, the boy grinning with cake on his cheeks, the teenager holding his first basketball trophy, the young man I once believed would carry my legacy. I whispered into the silence, "Where did I lose you, David? Where did I go wrong?" But the photos had no answers, only reminders. The next morning, I met with the district attorney. I laid the folder on his desk and said the words I'd feared all along. "Everything you need to bury him is here." The DA flipped through the documents, his eyes widening with every page. "Mr. Miller, this is enough to ensure your son never sees daylight again. Are you sure you want this?" I hesitated only for a breath. "Yes. If I don't stop him, he'll destroy us all." And so, the final act began. The trial turned into a storm. The prosecution painted David as a mastermind of crime, the heir who chose blood over legacy. Witnesses came forward, men he had threatened, partners he had cheated. Even one gang member who admitted David had ordered the car bombing. The courtroom gasped when the evidence of the payment surfaced. I sat there, silent, my heart heavy but unflinching. For once, David's smirk faltered. When it was my turn to testify, I stood tall, my voice steady. I told the court everything. How I built the company, how I tried to guide my son, how he called me a failure, how he tried to burn my name to the ground. Every word was a knife, cutting me as much as it cut him. David's eyes never left me. Cold, unforgiving. Hatred poured from him like poison. And then in front of the judge, in front of the world, he shouted, "You were never a father. You were a tyrant. I'll rot in here before I bow to you." The guards restrained him, dragging him back into his seat. The courtroom buzzed, the air heavy with the stench of our broken bond. And I realized something in that moment. I hadn't just lost a son. I had created an enemy who carried my blood. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the 4th, they returned with their verdict, guilty. David Miller was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Linda collapsed into tears. Emily sobbed into my chest. The reporters outside screamed for statements. But I walked out of that courthouse a hollow man. I had won, but it felt nothing like victory. Because the price of revenge is never the enemy, it's yourself. But fate wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the sentencing, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just one line written in my son's handwriting. "This isn't over, old man." And that's when I knew. The war I thought I had ended had only just begun. The letter sat on my desk like a loaded gun. "This isn't over, old man." I read it over and over, my hands trembling, my chest burning with dread. He was behind bars for life. How could it not be over? But those 4 words carried more weight than the verdict, more weight than the explosion, more weight than every courtroom gas combined. My son wasn't finished. And I knew then, men like David don't need freedom to sow chaos. They only need loyalty, and he had plenty of that on the outside. The first strike came a week later. One of my construction sites was set on fire. Heavy machinery melted into skeletons. Contracts pulled. Employees scattered like ash in the wind. Investigators said it looked like arson. I knew better. It was a message. The second strike was closer to home. Emily's car was rammed off the road one evening. She survived with a broken arm, but when she called me from the hospital, her voice was shaky. "Dad," someone whispered my name before they drove away. That was when I realized David had extended the battlefield beyond me. He was coming after what I loved most. I sat in my study that night. The house quiet, Linda asleep upstairs, Emily bandaged and resting. The gun lay on my desk. The shadows on the walls seemed to lean closer, listening. For 30 years, I had built a legacy brick by brick. Now, I was prepared to tear it down stone by stone just to keep my family alive. But I wasn't going to play defense anymore. Through contacts, I traced a network David had built before prison. Small-time crooks, gang affiliates, loan sharks. I dug deeper, and what I uncovered chilled me. Even behind bars, David had positioned himself as a boss. He was running operations from prison, using coded letters, hidden messages and phone calls, and loyal soldiers on the outside. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was a kingpin. So I did the unthinkable. I went to the police, not as a father seeking protection, but as a man offering them a deal. I handed them every scrap of evidence, every document, every thread of David's empire I had uncovered, enough to trigger a full-scale investigation into his network. The DA looked me in the eye. "Mr. Miller, you're declaring war on your son." I swallowed the lump in my throat. He declared it first. And so the hammer fell. Raids swept the city. David's men were arrested one by one. Warehouses seized. Accounts frozen. In prison, his privileges were cut off. His empire collapsed like a house of cards a storm. But victory is never clean. One night, as I walked Linda to the car after dinner, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of us. The door flew open, and a masked man raised a gun. Time slowed. I shoved Linda behind me, the flash of fire exploding in the night. Pain ripped through my shoulder. I staggered, blood soaking my shirt. The gunman ran before the police arrived. But the message was clear. David still had claws. Lie in a hospital bed, stitches in my shoulder, Emily holding my hand, Linda silently praying by the window. I realized something I had refused to admit all along. This wasn't about legacy anymore. It wasn't about pride or buildings or the Miller name carved into steel beams. It was about survival. And survival meant making peace with the truth I had fought for too long. I would never get my son back. The sentencing hadn't killed him. The raids hadn't killed him. The betrayal hadn't killed him. David was gone, and in his place stood a man who would never stop until one of us was buried 6 feet under. So I wrote him a letter. My hands shook as I penned the words, but my heart was steady. David, you call me a failure. Maybe I was. But the true failure isn't the man who loses what he built. It's the man who destroys what he was given. You lost everything not because of me, but because of you. And this where you started? It ends now. If you ever try to touch this family again, you won't live to regret it. That's not a threat. That's a promise. I sealed the letter, handed it to the prison courier, and waited. Days later, a reply came. It was short, just one sentence in his handwriting. The same handwriting that had once scribbled childish drawings on my office walls. Then I'll see you in hell, Dad. I folded the letter, slid it into the drawer beside the gun, and closed it. For the first time in years, I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel guilt. I only felt resolve. Legacy wasn't about buildings. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about a name. Legacy was about who stood when the fire burned everything else to ash. David had chosen his path. I had chosen mine. And when the day came that our paths crossed again, only one Miller would walk away.